I'm gonna kill the bear. Say it, I'm gonna kill the bear. Say it. I'm gonna kill the bear. Say it. Say I'm gonna kill the bear. I'm gonna kill the bear! You're goddamn right.
Man vs. Wild. A story as old as time itself. In this video we're going to take a look at the main event. The heavyweight badass contender versus the super heavyweight champion of the wild. This is a story about grit, never quit, get stuck in and hit the git. This is the legend of Eugene Lyle Moe, better known as Gene Moe.
I didn't like too much I was saying.
I don't care what other people say.
Really was coming from my face, pure and there.
Never in the field of human conscience was so much owed by so many to so few.
By the content of their character.
Where did we get such men? At the going down of the sun, we will remember them.
Korean War veteran Eugene Lyle Moe was an old school badass from the greatest generation. He roamed the plains of Anchorage, Alaska since the 40s, cut from that special iron that only men of his era were moulded in. His true grit was honed after the war from laying concrete for a living and hunting for his food like a proper frontiersman. Gene served in the US Airforce during the Korean War and was a lifelong avid outdoorsman. His friends and family described him as a gentle giant, a strong man. He stood 6 foot 3 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds. Gene was a gentleman, but while on a routine hunting trip in the unforgiving crucible of nature, he had to become an absolute savage to survive. On November 1st, 1999, while hunting Sitka black-tailed deer on Raspberry Island of the Kodiak Archipelago with his son Carl and employees Tom Froelich and Steve Fitzpatrick, 68-year-old Gene Moe would come face to face with one of nature's most vicious and powerful killers. Arriving on Raspberry Island by skiff, the men separated into pairs and headed out into the woods to hunt for blacktails. They were well aware that the island was populated by brown bears, so Gene came up with a plan to deal with the danger. The men would work in teams of 2. Gene paired up with Steve Fitzpatrick. Steve would head up to the ridge about 200 meters away, while Gene would trek around on a circular path in the hopes of flushing deer towards Steve's position. If either one of them got a deer, the other would listen for the shot and the hoot of an owl and head over immediately. Steve had dropped the ear flaps of his hat, prompting Gene to inquire if he could still even hear with them down. Steve insisted that he could, so Gene carried on. The plan would have worked, but Steve didn't hear the 2 blacktails that Gene had flushed up his way. By about 2 o'clock, as the light was starting to fade, Gene spotted a nice buck for himself and successfully made the shot. Steve neither heard the shot or the hoot of the owl as Gene made his way over to field dress the deer. Gene waited for Steve to arrive, but after he didn't show, Gene started to process the deer alone. Gene skinned the animal's carcass and harvested the meat, laying it all out on a plastic sheet to be wrapped and carried back to the skiff. He'd put his rifle down about 5 feet away from him against the trunk of a fallen tree while he worked. Just as he was handling the heart and the liver, a withering roar bellowed from the bush that shattered the thrill of a successful hunt instantly. With a stomach-shrinking dump of adrenaline, he whipped his head to the left, towards the source of the sound. Gene knew what it was before his eyes confirmed it, but knowing didn't help steel him against the sight of a 750-pound Kodiak Bear standing 30 feet away from him. The brown bear was staring right at him, foaming at the mouth. His head was lowered, indicating that it was about to charge. Gene knew that if he turned to run, the bear would be right on him and take his back. He considered going for his rifle, but by the time he retrieved it and brought it to a firing position, it'd be all over. So he had no choice but to make a stand. He was still holding his Model 110 buck folding knife that he'd used to skin the deer in his right hand. The blade of the knife was only 3 3/4 inches in length, Not exactly ideal for fighting monstrous brown bear with, but it was all he had. There was no quit in this 68-year-old legend, and if he was going down, he wasn't going down without a fight. Casting the deer liver aside, Gene switched his stance and readied himself for the attack that he knew was coming. The massive bear roared, its gaping maw revealing large yellow teeth. And then it charged. Gene cried out, "Lord, help me! Lord, I need help!" and braced himself. He had only his buck knife and guts to fight back with. The bear closed the distance almost immediately, and he brought his knife up intending to drive it right down the bear's throat. But as the huge predator lunged for him, Gene's strike missed its intended target, and the blade of his knife cut across the cheek and alongside the head of the bear, slicing a deep gouge into its hide. Now enraged, the huge bear bit down onto his right arm just above the elbow and tore out a large chunk of muscle, tendon and skin. He could feel the bear shake furiously, trying to rip his arm off completely. Gene quickly reached over the bear's head with his left hand, intending to gouge out his eye, but he found its ear instead, so dug his finger in as far as it would go and twisted. The huge animal didn't like this and tried to pull away, but Gene's left arm was wrapped around its neck, almost in a headlock, and he held on. Gene saw an opportunity to lean on the bear and put it on the ground in a more vulnerable position, like he used to do with the young bulls in his youth. But the bear was too strong, and instead whipped its neck and flipped Gene into the air like an empty bottle, sending him flying 8 feet. He hit the ground hard, but got straight back up to his feet, ready for round 2. Gene had noticed from observing bears in the wild that they were much like humans, in that most were right side dominant. So as the big bear readjusted itself and came at him again, he circled away from its right paw like a prize fighter would the rear hand of his opponent. The bear stood up on its hind legs and spread wide its clawed arms, trying to herd Gene. It began circling him as Gene continued to avoid its right paw. An arena was now set like a boxing ring, and Gene was well aware that it was a fight to the death. Grizzly bears have the power to decapitate a cow with a single swipe, and Kodiak bears are larger than grizzlies, so Gene's eyes never left that bear's right paw. He circled towards his rifle, hoping to grab it as he passed by, but the right paw shot out for his head just as he anticipated, and Gene dodged the blow by leaning back like a boxer. The bear might not have got the killing blow it was looking for, but its claw did catch Gene's ear on the way round and ripped it in two. Having failed to take Gene out quickly, the bear became frustrated and dropped back to all fours, immediately going for Gene's legs. The animal made contact and swept the legs from under him. Gene fell flat on his back, the bear's claws having torn deep gouges in his leg. Gene anticipated the bear would rush in on top of him to make the kill, so he brought both of his heavily booted feet together and double kicked upward with all the strength that he could muster, just as the bear lunged in. Gene caught the massive bear right under the chin, knocking it off to one side. Then he sprang right back up, beating the bear to his feet. The bear righted itself and went straight after Gene again, circling and growling. Gene was now in full boxer mode, and he knew he had to stay inside of that right paw if he wanted to survive. The bear suddenly shot for Gene on all fours again and swung its large paw for his leg. Gene was stepping off at that moment and its paw wrapped around Gene's back instead. In a blink, it bit down on his right leg and shook violently, tearing out a large chunk of his flesh. Gene was immediately overcome with severe pain, but he wasn't going to just lie down and die. He was now inside that right paw of the bear, and his left arm wrapped over the animal's neck, and he planned payback. His right arm, the one in which he still gripped the knife, had no feeling, and the flesh above his elbow was hanging down by his wrist. But Gene was still able to use it. He stabbed that knife into the bear's neck 4 times as hard as he could. He then brought the blade up just under the jaw and cut deep, pushing his knife in as deep as it would go. The bear tried to stop him by lifting him off of his feet with its right paw, but Gene held onto the bear and continued to drive that knife into the beast's neck. The bear slammed him back down onto the ground, and Gene couldn't hold on as it pushed away from him with both front paws. But as it pulled its head out from Gene's left arm, he was able to get him one last strike with the knife, just under the jaw. This time he hit something hard, and blood sprayed out all over them both. The Kodiak's head cocked toward the side of the injury, and it backed off quickly. Noticing the bear's hesitation, Gene yelled, "Come on, bear, the Lord is on my side." Incensed, the bear charged him. Gene noticed that the blood was still gushing from the stab wound and that its head was cocked oddly to one side. But Gene was also in bad shape, with the flesh of his right arm stripped from the bone like a banana peel, both shoulders covered in claw gouges, and a large chunk of his right thigh missing. He was losing a lot of blood and was battered and bruised, but he could sense victory. Knowing that the Lord was with him, he rushed in to meet the bear head on. Remembering that a hard blow from a club to the nose would stop almost any animal, Gene loaded up on his left fist, ready to let fly. As the bear leapt toward him, Gene threw the hardest punch that he ever threw in his life. He missed the nose, but struck the bear just under the eye. The combined force of Gene's punch and the forward momentum of the bear's 750 pounds was so great that Gene's left arm immediately turned white, and he had no feeling left in the knuckles or the hand. The bear's large head twitched and hit the ground head first, burrowing into the moss. Both front paws folded underneath it. It had collapsed in such a way that Gene knew it was dead, but he wasn't taking any chances. So he hobbled his way over to the rifle, intending to shoot the bear for good measure. But his right hand was still clenched around a buck knife, and he couldn't release his grip, so he resorted to pulling his fingers apart with his teeth. When the knife fell, Gene was able to use his powerless right hand to cock the bolt of the rifle and put a round in the chamber. He raised the rifle to fire, but the flesh of his injured arm fell across the scope and obscured his view. So he raised the rifle higher, causing the flesh to fall over to one side, and brought the rifle back down to fire a shot into the bear. For good measure, he fired a second time. Lumps of fur blew off on both shots, but the bear didn't flinch either time, confirming to Gene that it was already dead. He'd done it, done the impossible. He'd gone hand to hand with a Kodiak Bear and kicked ass, a true feat of legend. But his ordeal was far from over. He was stranded alone and badly injured. On top of it all, he was losing a lot of blood and far from any help. Gene lay down by the bear's body and sat back against it. He hoped that the others would have heard the commotion and come to aid him, but they didn't. His open wounds were a problem that he had to deal with there and then if he wanted to last long enough for rescue. So he pulled up the flesh of his right arm, put it back into place as best he could, and wrapped it up tight with a plastic bag. His feet were still able to move, but he could only drag his right leg. And with the scent of his blood in the air, he decided to bring his rifle with him, even though the extra weight was difficult to carry in his condition. He recovered his knife, which he slipped into his pocket. Gene asked the Lord for help again, so he set off toward the beach, busted up and close to death. Didn't know for sure if he was heading in the right direction. He was most likely in shock, and his mind wasn't clear by this point. The woods were dense, and it was getting dark. Snow was falling from the sky. Halfway through his arduous journey, Gene collapsed from exhaustion and had to lie down in the snow, convinced that he was about to die. But the 68-year-old badass had no quit in him, and after taking some time out to recompose himself and eating some snow that he had balled up with his hand, he recovered enough strength that he could try and get back to his feet. But he couldn't sit up, so he turned over and pushed himself up with his left arm and leg. At this point he could no longer carry his rifle, so he had to leave it behind, figuring that even if he ran into another bear at this stage, he was in no condition to do anything about it. Gene collapsed at least twice more before he could make it back to the beach. He didn't know how long it took him to get back, or even if he had been going the right way, but when he emerged from the woods, he was greeted by the sight of the beach and the skiff, and knew he'd come as far as he could. He staggered to the beach and fell to the ground, where he stayed for a short time, before using his last drop of energy to yell out for his friends. Luckily, his friend Tom Froelich found him at the beach, and ran to his side. Gene repeatedly asked Tom to shoot him and end his suffering, believing his condition to be unrecoverable, but Tom refused, telling him that if he still felt the same way tomorrow, then they'd talk about it. His son Carl and Steve arrived soon after, and the men rendered whatever medical assistance they could, but it wasn't enough. Gene would require immediate medical attention, and the nearest phone was at a German couple's cabin across the bay. So the men loaded Gene onto the boat and set off for the cabin. Luckily, the people living there were kind enough to take Gene in, bandage up his wounds, and call for the Coast Guard. Tom actually put the flesh of Gene's mangled arm back into place and wrapped it up properly. He did such a good job handling the wound that the doctor would later comment on it. By the grace of God, the Coast Guard were actually carrying out a training exercise in the area at the time, so the helicopter arrived very quickly to pick Gene up and fly him to a brand new hospital in Kodiak. where the doctors spent 7 hours patching him up. After a month of rehab, 2 skin grafts and over 500 stitches, Gene Moe would make a full recovery. Gene's friends would return to the island and follow the blood trail back to the scene of the battle. Along the way, they recovered Gene's rifle and found the carcass of the Kodiak Bear that he defeated. It turned out to be a sow, and she had just run off her cubs before the encounter with Gene due to a lack of salmon that year. His friends skinned the bear and brought the hide back for Gene, and he would later mount it on his wall where it would stay for the rest of his life, alongside the framed buck knife. After recovering from his wounds, Gene stayed active by taking up golf, and he continued to hunt well into his 80s. Eugene Lyle Moe passed away peacefully at his home in Austin, Colorado on January 22, 2018, at the age of 85. He left behind him a loving family and a legacy that will inspire others. I've come across some badasses before, man, but never one who went toe to toe with a Kodiak Bear and beat the crap out of it. My hat is off to you, sir. No backing down. Well, what did you think of that? Something else, isn't it? Were you as impressed as me? Let me know in the comments down below, or any other stories that you think I might be interested in, other legends and so forth. As always, thanks for watching it this far. I really appreciate it. Helps out the channel, helps me out, and I love you for it. Please like and subscribe for more if you want it. Duke out.
So I had the liver in my left hand, I had my knife in the right hand, and all at once a bear about 30 feet come growling and coming at me in full speed. And I remember saying this, "Lord, please help me, I need help." And about that time the bear was right to me, and my idea was to put the knife down the bear's throat. And you know what? That bear didn't like that. He growled and pulled away from me, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I says, "Come on," I says, "the Lord's on my side."